Matthew, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Steve.
Well, I feel like you have just exploded on the Bitcoin scene here in recent months. And I took a look at your background and I thought, wow, this is a guy that I really want to have a conversation with. So just looking at some of the things that you've done here is you're a management consultant and you advise the government on security issues and resilience challenges. You also apply strategic foresight and risk assessment and policy analysis methodologies to evaluate how Bitcoin intersects with national security issues. So that's sort of what you do. Now, your academic background is also quite impressive. Master's degree in philosophy and public policy with distinction from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's degree in physics and philosophy with honors from Johns Hopkins University. So quite a background there. So what would you like to fill in there? Any gaps there, and also how you got into Bitcoin?
Yes, yeah, I have a kind of interesting background. I think most folks that come into Bitcoin have very different and interesting backgrounds. Yeah, so I approached kind of my undergraduate very much as a physics person. So I went into undergrad thinking I was going to get a PhD in physics, and then I got really interested in philosophy along the way. So I did a sort of double major there. I did a pivot sort of halfway through, recognizing I didn't want to actually pursue a PhD, and so I finished the degree, but I knew that I wanted to go into a different direction. So I did some additional internships on the Hill and kind of got into sort of policy making world. And then I decided to do a graduate degree to kind of stall for time. So I spent a year over in London, kind of trying to bridge between my more academic background into the sort of public policy world. So I did a master's in philosophy and public policy. And then I came back to the States and I picked up a job at the National Science Foundation as kind of a 2-year relatively short-term position as a science assistant, where I supported like a cluster of programs in economics, decision-making, and risk sciences and the science of organizations. So every 6 months, we basically did a big panel to sort of facilitate how the government was going to give out money in these different disciplines. So I got a really kind of bird's eye view of kind of the academic sort of disciplines and how they're thinking about behavioral economics, traditional economics, kind of organizational science. And then I, kind of went to the job hunt and I kind of stumbled into management consulting. I joined a startup, kind of small firm that was doing some really interesting work. And I basically grew my career there, kind of jumping from interesting project to project. And as you mentioned, kind of more focused in kind of the security space, really specialized in doing kind of preparedness analysis and assessment, how the government and society is prepared for all sorts of bad situations and help to advise kind of policymakers, decision makers at different levels of government about different threats and opportunities, both from sort of natural hazards, man-made hazards, as well as sort of emerging technology. So that's been kind of my journey over the past 10 years professionally. I certainly got involved in Bitcoin as everyone else kind of has multiple bites at the apple. So I had a number of friends who were kind of early to this space back in 2013 and 2015. And I always thought it was just sort of this scammy, weird thing. And it never really kind of popped up on my radar very seriously until really, I think it was a very similar kind of Michael Saylor journey where kind of the March 2020 sort of crisis from COVID and the financial system really kind of precipitated me to taking a second look at sort of the structure of the macroeconomy, the US government's sort of fiscal position, and just sort of the overall state of how our global system is structured. And that's when I started getting deeper into the Bitcoin rabbit hole, as everyone kind of has a version of that story. So that's kind of when I really got really deeply into it and started kind of doing my 1,000 hours of research throughout 2020 and kind of developed kind of deeper and deeper conviction and kind of more nuanced understanding about how Bitcoin now is going to play a role in kind of the next several years in particular as sort of this the sort of global system starts to evolve in pretty dramatic ways.
Well, you've seen that I've done a number of podcasts with philosophers, and you have, it looks like, a couple degrees in philosophy, and I have philosophy envy. I'm a wannabe philosopher. So I always take every opportunity when I get a chance to talk to someone with a philosophy background to ask them a question. So that's not going to be the main thrust of our conversation here today, but we'll just go a little segue here for a second. So when it comes to philosophy, What were you studying? Was there a particular aspect or area of philosophy that you got most into? And then are you able to apply any of the things that you learned through philosophy to how you're thinking about and exploring Bitcoin?
Yeah, those are big topics. Yeah, so I got deeply into philosophy through philosophy of physics. So I was always very interested in kind of the fundamental metaphysical ontological questions, where physics is about trying to understand what is sort of a mathematical description of reality. How can we sort of better understand sort of the rules by which the world runs itself? But physics, usually within the domain of physics, those types of sort of what's underneath questions sort of get put off to the side. It's sort of shut up and calculate. Don't try to understand exactly what quantum mechanics means. Just trust that the equations work in the experiments and allow you to perform accurate calculations. And so that always sort of left me unsatisfied. And so I turned to sort of the philosophical side of those questions, really understand, well, what does this really, quote unquote, mean? How do we interpret these physical theories? How do we construct a consistent sort of worldview that answers some of those more basic questions? And so I got really interested in sort of philosophy through more fundamental theories of physics and how do we interpret those, as well as sort of the questions of philosophy of mind. So what is consciousness? How do we understand how this weird thing called qualitative experience fits into the sort of explanations we have about the world that's fundamentally physical or sort of apparently reductionist? And how do you reconcile those two very different accounts of reality, between what physics tells you as sort of this mathematical pattern that's manifested through these physical objects and qualitative subjective personal experience? Those are radically different things, yet they both apparently have some reality to them. And how do we create a consistent worldview that accounts for those? So that's really where I got into philosophy. And I still have sort of a layperson's kind of interest in following kind of latest developments in theoretical physics, and I try to track some of the interesting developments in philosophy of mind and philosophy of physics as well.
So, how would philosophy answer the question, is Bitcoin real?
Well, I think you've had some good conversations with some of those philosophers that have tried to answer that question in maybe a little bit more professional way than I would. I think Craig Warmke in particular has an interesting account of Bitcoin as a fictional substance. And I find that a really compelling kind of analysis of Bitcoin, which has to do with the way it's built, right? And how the technical features of its design connect to how do we interpret it as a sort of a concept. And this is not just related to Bitcoin, this is related to money in general as social fictions, right? These things are just as real as anything else we interact with in our social world, right? Institutions, companies, governments. These things are fictional constructions that we have mutual and enduring belief in. And Bitcoin is a version of that. Bitcoin has a certain set of design principles that help it kind of reify that social fiction that's based off of a certain technical design to kind of incentivize human beings to continuously maintain and stick to that common story. And so there's this interplay between kind of the social layer about Bitcoin, mutual beliefs about other people's beliefs about Bitcoin, and what Bitcoin is actually, the hard code and how it's constructed. So I think that's a really interesting analysis as a shared fiction, essentially a story that we're all collectively writing. And that's the story of the movement of these fictional quantities called Bitcoin from one address to another address. And so that's a really interesting idea, sort of combining this somewhat abstract account of Bitcoin and sort of using the terms and sort of techniques and terminology of technical philosophy and applying it to Bitcoin. I encourage folks to go out and read that paper.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I've got several. Well, I have all three of the resistance money philosophers. I've done podcasts with them. I've also had Troy Cross on as well. So, folks that really want to go deep down the rabbit hole on philosophy, you can definitely go back and listen to the episodes that I did with them. But let's make a switch here. Let's go from philosophy to war and geopolitics. So we're going to make a big switch here. Good pivot. So I want to read a quote here. So you had an article in Bitcoin Magazine back in January 19th. So here's a quote that I pulled out that I think will help set the stage for our conversation. So you said, quote, "The current balance of global power is defined by complex arrangements of military alliances, trade flows, ethnic and religious affinity, cultural influence, linguistic agreement, and of course, national borders. In this author's view, it is hubris to expect Bitcoin to singularly override or sweep away the accumulated weight and historical inertia of this tightly bound matrix of interlinked forces. And then I'm going to skip ahead here. Then you went on to say, and yet we can still and increasingly must analyze the question of violence, especially state violence, in a future world order where Bitcoin is a major, if not the dominant, economic and political force. So where I want to focus a lot of our conversation today is really on Bitcoin, how that might affect geopolitical arrangements. So with what I just described as a setup, let me just start with, why do humans go to war with each other?
Well, for lots of reasons. And I think, the story of humanity is the story of, various forms of violent competition, the more organized forms of which have taken a kind of the label war, especially in the kind of the modern era where we created states with modern armies, and they go to battle with each other to compete over various resources, interests, religious competitions. And so, I mean, the story of history, pick up a history book, is usually the story of war in some form or fashion, or the remnants of war, the recovery from war, and the new kind of ordering pattern of states and trade that results from the outcome of war. So, I mean, human beings go to war for all sorts of reasons. In fact, it's sort of the default condition if you're not in kind of a period of global peace like we've sort of enjoyed, is kind of a historical anomaly since World War II. And there's some folks who think that anomaly may be just that, an anomaly. And the question is, what comes next? And what has been sustaining this period of global peace, relative global peace, especially in the West. Other countries certainly have seen their fair share of violence and disorder. But war on the scale that most modern society hasn't seen, is not necessarily ruled out forever. And so the question is, what are those conditions that precipitate violent conflict, especially at the scale of state on state violence? And where does Bitcoin fit into that? That's a big question. We can certainly get into that. But yeah, human beings go to war for lots of reasons, and I think those reasons aren't necessarily going to be easily swiped away by Bitcoin's existence. There's certain things that Bitcoin could do as a matter of incentives and restructuring of the global economic system in a way that could mitigate certain forms of state violence. But there's other factors that it may not address, at least not in the near term. Essential aspects of human nature, conflict over creed, conflict over scarce resources, just group irrationality, leaders taking power, and wagging the dog. There's lots of things that can precipitate human conflict.
Yeah, and so I do want to delve into the connection between Bitcoin and war, because there are some folks out there, I think a lot of people maybe have some hope that Bitcoin might be an agent that can reduce the likelihood of war or reduce the incentives for people to have war, and that maybe we shift from a physical war with humans and technology, or at least physical machinery, for example, to one that is more fought electrically, let's say, or hash wars. So how do you think about that? How do you think about Bitcoin as, if it does become a global standard, if we get to a hyper Bitcoinization period where that might be the end of fiat currencies, for example, people can't just go into massive debt to fund warmongering. So how are you thinking about what Bitcoin might be able to do and what it won't be able to do? Because I think your take is that it's not as big of a panacea as some people think when it comes to reducing future wars.
Well, I guess I would say I don't know, and this is all speculation, and reasoning about the future evolution of geopolitics and state relations in the absence of Bitcoin is extremely difficult. In fact, it's probably one of the things that stresses all world leaders out, and economists and hedge funds. Everyone's trying to predict how the global system is going to evolve. So trying to answer the question of how the global system is going to evolve with Bitcoin imposes an additional complexity. And so I think it's fair to go into that question with a lot of intellectual humility. We're trying to reason somewhat generally about the future, and we're trying to look at what are the patterns, what are the structural drivers that could evolve in various ways. And so, this is all reasoning, speculation, trying to look at competing forces and where those directions are going to be or could go. And so I don't think anyone knows the precise answer. But I guess the way I would start in trying to sort of sketch out different scenarios and then trying to assign weight to those scenarios in terms of what's likely or what's less likely. You look for kind of current trends, and then you look for things that are kind of going to be enduring kind of structural constraints or structural features of human competition, human conflict, things that are just hard to change. And then you look for what could change those things. And so when I look ahead, I see, what would a hyper-Bitcoinized world look like? Well, that's sort of the first challenge. How do you sketch out what exactly would be the nature of the constraint that Bitcoin would place on nation states, in particular, say, fiscal constraints, right? And so then you have to look at, okay, the assumptions that we're making about how hard of a fiscal constraint does Bitcoin actually impose on states if it's adopted at a global scale? And then you have to answer second questions, like, is there going to be an elimination entirely of sovereign debt, of sovereign credit? Is that just going to go away? There can be arguments one way or the other. I think it's plausible to expect that sovereign debt, to the extent that it's issued in a fiat system, is certainly going to be substantially constrained. But human beings still make promises, and those promises can be codified in forms of instruments that can be, called credit. And there's no reason why states couldn't issue those promises in bonds. And so just because Bitcoin exists as a neutral reserve asset that's on a balance sheet doesn't mean that governments can't make promises using that as collateral. And so does sovereign debt go away entirely? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. It's certainly probably be constrained. And so the question of war is a question of war financing. Is the government going to be able to afford large-scale war? And the question is, okay, well, I think even if they can't borrow to fund war, they will probably still be able to tax. And whether it's nation states or some social entity that's sub-nation state, still going to have some collective taxing ability. At least, some folks argue that that will be entirely deconstructed. I'm somewhat in the middle there. I think there will still be reasonably large social entities. We could call them states or microstates or city states, however you imagine kind of this decentralized future, where there's going to be a collective defense need and taxation or contributions to raise funds for collective defense. And where does that money go? It goes into procuring arms to defend your territory, right? And so the argument of Bitcoin that I think I agree with in sort of directionally is that it demonetizes a number of sort of physical assets that are principally the locus of competition that are, I'm going to go in and invade your territory to take your gold. And it's just very difficult to seize someone's Bitcoin as opposed to seizing someone's gold. And to the extent that that's true, I think that does act as a mitigating force against forms of violent conquest with the specific objective of seizing tangible wealth. And if Bitcoin manages to sort of dematerialize the physical wealth that can be seized, then it de-incentivizes that form of violent conquest. But I think that's a subset of all the forms of war and the motivations for war. And so while it might mitigate some form of war, it doesn't mitigate all forms of war. And there's a few other kind of things that might also kind of occur along the way that might make violence at scale, in fact, easier, right? And so this is actually a corollary of a thesis that Jeff Booth has popularized, in his book, The Price of Tomorrow. And the argument of, in his book is, the technological force of innovation is inherently deflationary. So, we just get better at making stuff that does more for less. And the stuff that we make that does more for less includes weapons. And so we get more capable weapons for less cost every year. And you can see this in things like drones and things like AI that's applied to military applications, synthetic biology. These things all have military applications, and the cost associated with them is being driven down by technological innovation. And that's the thing that a lot of Bitcoiners point to, is sort of the synergy that's aligned with Bitcoin's inherent deflationary nature, is that these two things are going to work in tandem. And that sort of is the right alignment for when you have a monetary system that aligns with technological deflation. But one implication of that is, weapons get cheaper over time. And that means even if states can't raise as much funds as they raise now to build aircraft carriers or, large standing armies, the trends in warfare and armaments are actually moving away from those large manned expensive platforms and more towards unmanned autonomous systems that are much cheaper, much more democratized. And so you can imagine a future where states have less of a budget for war, but the things that that smaller budget buys are much more capable than even the weapons they have today. And so, that's a trend you have to reckon with. It'll be cheaper to fight war, at least especially deploy weapons at lower cost. And the other kind of thing we'll have to reckon with is that those weapons, as we sort of are seeing increasingly now in conflicts around the world, are not necessarily going to be in the province of nation states. Right now, small, relatively less advanced terrorist groups can build and construct UAS that function just like cruise missiles 10 years ago did. And that trend is only going to accelerate. Synthetic biology as a tool for medicine and an enormous kind of medical breakthroughs. The double side of that is bathtub brew viruses from some disaffected postdoc who's cooking up a synthetic virus in his basement. And those are just where technology is going to take threats. And so I think it's just, we need to be practical. And I like the theoretical argument. I think it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of merit to sort of reasoning on kind of that kind of abstract level. And what I try to go is like more practically, like the next 5, 10, 15 years, where is technology going to go? And is it likely that Bitcoin's going to, obviously solve some of those trends that are going to make war cheaper, more destructive, and more democratized? And I don't see that happening in the near future. Now, you could suppose a really far future, 50 years, 100 years ahead of where we are today, and start to reason about, other sorts of more utopian social relations that Bitcoin has now enabled that allow the formation of institutional structures that prevent that type of, violence from erupting at scale. And that's possible. But for me, 50 years, 100 years from today, it's so far ahead of the future that I don't know if we can reason very accurately about it. You can tell good stories, but for me, it's more kind of speculative science fiction than kind of a practical, consideration for how Bitcoin is going to intersect with geopolitics and state competition in at least, the next few decades.
So earlier you mentioned that we have not had a global war since World War II. And of course that coincides with the development of nuclear capability. And so we've got this nuclear deterrent, and all the major powers have nuclear capability. So we know we've got this mutually assured destruction out there. So that obviously is one reason why we haven't had a global war. So on the one hand, we've got that, and then we've got what you're talking about here in terms of the deflationary pressure that technology generates, and that's happening with military technology. So we've got drones. We've seen small countries attack the oil infrastructure in the Middle East and cause significant damage for just some very inexpensive drones. So we've got that kind of stuff going on, and that's a perfect example, I think, of what you're talking about with the technology getting cheaper and the cost of war getting cheaper, while the amount of damage that they can do can increase significantly, even as the cost of the tech is going down. But then as we're having our conversation here today, and who knows, by the time this gets released, maybe it'll be totally different. But as we're talking here today, we've got Russia has a massive human force, massive military physical equipment on the border with Ukraine. So maybe they invade, maybe they don't. So how do you think about what Russia is doing? What's in their mind? If they're thinking, are they bluffing? Is it just a tactical maneuver to as part of a negotiating strategy that they really don't have any intention of invading? They're just trying to use that to flex some muscle here. What are your thoughts with them maybe even doing a ground invasion? And does that, if that were to happen, would that upset the thinking of how wars are going to be conducted? Because Russia obviously is one of the superpowers here.
Yeah, and I have no kind of special classified insight into this question. So I'm not, what I'm saying here is just based off of what I'm aware of from open source information. And I think it's exceedingly likely that Putin will conduct a military operation in Ukraine. That's been what I've been thinking since November, that he's more likely than not going to do something. And I've just become increasingly convinced that that's more likely in the past few weeks. So I think it's inevitable that he's going to do something. I would suspect even as middle of next week. the 15th or something like that could be where he decides to move. The question is, what does he actually do? Now, I'm not a military strategist. I just read smart people who are. And the question is, what are his objectives in Ukraine? There's a long history about what sort of NATO expansion has meant for Russia, how Russia has precipitated political destabilization in Ukraine, and sort of the tit for tat between the West and the East, with sort of Ukraine caught in the middle, has a long kind of history and kind of niche geopolitics there. So I won't go into that. But I think he's going to do something. Now it could be pretty dramatic. Ground invasion that follows a pretty severe aerial campaign that could be pretty destructive. Probably, if the reports seem to be right, it will be the most destructive military campaign since World War II in Europe. And I don't think folks have, we're not really prepared for seeing something like that. We haven't sort of seen that in the modern era. We're most used to proxy campaigns, counterterrorism campaigns, insurgencies, large scale military mobilization with the full force of a tier one military power on another large military power is not something we've seen in decades. And I think it will be very dramatic and pretty horrific. Now, what happens after that? I mean, who knows, right? There's a lot of ways this could spiral in various bad scenarios. And I don't want to go into all of those, but I think we should be prepared, especially for the folks in your audience, in terms of what are the financial implications or kind of the political, geopolitical implications here. Is one, the U.S. is committed to unleash pretty severe sanctions on Putin and Russia for any incursion, and if that becomes increasingly baked in, then what's going to be the counter reaction to that? And so if we really sanction most of the Russian banks, really tighten all the export controls we have, essentially try to strangle their economy, the nuclear option, quote unquote, in the financial world would be a SWIFT cutoff, where we can essentially cut them off of the SWIFT sort of interbank kind of communication system. And that would be, very dramatic, especially for Germany, where Germany relies a lot on energy imports from Russia, and they pay for those, via bank transfers over the SWIFT system. And if Germany can't pay for Russian energy, it's going to be a big problem. And so there's a big tie-in between the geopolitics of Ukraine, Europe, energy, and the West. The other thing that I'm worried about is escalation in sort of the cyber physical domain, where there's certain things that you could do as a retaliatory measure that would be sort of sub-threshold of like conventional attack or sabotage that Putin may consider to retaliate against us cutting off his financial system that could be affecting our financial system. And I would just note that there was that glitch on February 24th, I think, of 2021, where the Fed wire went down for about half the day. And that had like a domino effect that rippled through the Treasury market for several weeks thereafter that didn't get a whole lot of play. But, that going down is a big deal. Things like various clearing houses that we use to sort of settle securities are also kind of critical nodes. So there's lots of things that this could escalate and spill over from a localized but pretty horrific campaign in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine to a more globalized, sort of more destabilizing scenario. So I don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, everyone hopes that cooler heads will prevail. But this is a very fraught situation. The other thing I would note is kind of the geopolitical context for Putin's move here, I think, has to be seen in light of his trip to Beijing just last week, when he went over there to open up the Olympics, had a really warm and public meeting with President Xi, and they released a really detailed statement that was very, very explicit about a kind of new no limits partnership between Russia and China. And that, has been moving in that direction for a number of years. And this kind of sort of anchored it. And now broadcast to the world, China and Russia are in this together, and they're going to back each other up. And that has a pretty large geopolitical consequence if you think about kind of the post-war system. that's, from my perspective, the first, second, and third priority for the U.S. after World War II has been to prevent the emergence of a Eurasian power bloc between Russia and China. The geopolitical strategist Mackinder calls that like the world island, and then Europe, North Africa, Middle East, South Asia, East Asia is the periphery of that world island, and who controls the world island kind of controls the world system. And so you could see the moves of the post-war era between Nixon going to China and essentially trying to peel them off of Russia as being kind of one of the most critical geostrategic wins of the 20th century, was essentially pulling apart those two powers and dividing Eurasia between them. And then as China rose to power, Russia declined in power. And, the Soviet system collapsed in the 90s. And then there was that glorious era of the 90s where China was still weak, but growing. And we thought we could sort of convert them to the liberal order. And Russia had totally collapsed and had sort of descended into this sort of mafia state. Again, weak with a lot of nuclear power, but not geopolitically relevant. And I think the story of the past 20 years has been, as we've been bogged down in the Middle East with these Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we've been essentially tied up and distracted while China has really launched themselves into kind of peer status, and their economy is now the largest global trading partner for the world. We won't go to all the statistics, but China is now repositioning themselves at the center of the global economic system, and Russia, as sort of a second partner to them in terms of landmass and military power, is now re-strengthened behind an autocratic Putin. So the moment that we're in is the U.S. is confronting a new balance of power arrangement that's unlike anything that we've confronted in the past, decades. And that's something that, those powers know, and they're looking to test the existing system and looking for ways to precipitate a change in the status quo that's going to, force the U.S. to respond in various ways. And these sorts of situations typically resolve themselves with war. Now, we hope that we find other ways around that, but that's the period where we're entering in, is this sort of rising states challenging the existing order and forming partnerships and control over strategic resources and land in order to challenge Western and U.S.-led kind of liberal order, hegemony. So again, that's a lot of geopolitics, but I think that's the context of Ukraine. I mean, that's Ukraine, but there's a larger game afoot.
So why now? And what I mean by that is, why would Putin want to be potentially invading Ukraine now? Because all the things that you described there, he's obviously well aware that if they invade Ukraine, there's going to be massive financial ramifications. They're going to be, kicked off the SWIFT system. I mean, all these other sanctions that are going to be put in place. Do you think Russia is far enough along in reducing their dependency on the US dollar, and that they're tight enough with China? Maybe China's going to be their backstop. I mean, is that part of the thing where Putin's thinking, hey, I'm okay if I don't do any future business with the United States because I'm sort of off of the dollar dependency, and now I can sell my oil in rubles or whatever, and I've got China backstopping me. And maybe Bitcoin plays into this too, because Putin seems to have done maybe a bit of a 180 here recently in being more receptive to Bitcoin. So with those thoughts, what are you thinking in terms of why now for Russia to possibly invade?
Yeah, it's speculation, but looking at kind of the trends. So one, you think about Putin's psychology. He's a gambler, he's a risk taker, and he prefers doing something over doing nothing. And he's been no stranger to military operations in the past 10 years between Syria, Ukraine the first time, Georgia, and sort of other operations and sort of arm's length coups all throughout Africa. So he's been very busy and is no stranger to using military force. Now, this is another level, obviously, and comes with a larger set of consequences that he's going to have to calculate. And I think he's made those calculations. Whether he's fully confident that he'll be able to withstand the second and third order consequences or not, I don't know. But I think he's going to gamble and thinks that the odds are in his favor. Now, what are those calculations, right? So that I think maybe helping him feel like now is the time. One, I think, is obviously China having us back. So they have certainly a synergy where China is Russia's largest, energy importer, and Russia is their largest, energy exporter. Russia, we import oil from Russia, and most of Europe requires Russian gas. And in a cold winter, that's a really key point of leverage. And I think you've seen the past few months, right? The inflationary backdrop of the COVID response has given Putin a lever point to sort of dial those pipes down a bit, and really, demonstrate to the Europeans how dependent they are on him. And so being able to drive that as a wedge between NATO and the US and the European members of NATO. And, I think he's looking also at, just generally speaking, the Afghanistan pullout, was certainly not the best look for the US military. And maybe he felt like that was a symbol of, strategic retreat. And maybe he thinks, US politics isn't going to be able to cohere around a unified response to him if he makes this aggressive move. And so he's probably looking at a lot of different angles. Now, he could be wrong, right? There's no guarantee he's going to succeed. And history is littered with, overconfident leaders who make a military move that turns into a strategic disaster. So by no means do I think Putin is some grand strategist who's checkmated the West and, we're all done. He's seen an advantage here that he thinks he can move on. And then we're going to have to respond to that. And so, yeah. So China, so they just signed an agreement to essentially, I think 137 billion, I could have the number wrong, of like long-term 30-year kind of energy deal between Russia and China. And so there's that financial element, right? So where Bitcoin comes into play is interesting. And I think this is still speculative, but just in the past month, you saw kind of this 180, as you mentioned, between the central bank coming out and saying, we're going to ban cryptocurrency, and then the Ministry of Finance saying, actually, we think we have an interesting advantage here because of all the Bitcoin mining, and we have like $27 billion, if I have that number right, worth of Bitcoin holdings in among Russian citizens. And so Putin was like, get together and come up with a plan, and they did, and they released this kind of draft law that again, I'm not an expert on Russian financial system, but it looks to essentially like regularize cryptocurrency in Russia, allow it to be essentially traded and held. There's obviously going to be a lot more like in their version of KYC. So it's going to be probably more difficult to operate it in a pure private manner. Although, Bitcoin is censorship resistant money, and there's lots of examples of folks finding ways to use Bitcoin in more anonymous ways throughout the world. But they are looking, it seems to be more positively leaning towards Bitcoin, which is an interesting contrast to China, right? China banned Bitcoin mining, kicked them all out in June of last year. And that precipitated an exodus of Bitcoin mining around the world. And a lot of those miners actually went to Russia, which has a lot of excess hydro capacity and a cold weather climate, which makes it efficient to run these miners. And so, it's hard to say. I would be skeptical about the claim that Bitcoin is like at the center of Putin's strategic thinking at this point. I don't think it's what he's really saying is like his ace in the hole. I think it's for him an interesting curiosity. It's like a diversification. I think he's reasoning about it the way that a lot of Western hedge fund managers like Ray Dalio are reasoning about it, as like this interesting curiosity, clearly not going away. It's got a synthetic commodity-like property similar to gold, seems to be increasing like the internet and its adoption curve, but I don't really fully trust it, maybe, if I'm one of these traditional guys. But maybe I'll put a 5%, stake in it just as like in case. And I think, if that's what the billionaires like Ray Dalio and Stan Druckenmiller are thinking, it stands to reason that other, folks in that similar position would be thinking about. So is it the centerpiece of the strategy? I don't think so. Is it like a hedge? And is it a hedge that a lot of other, people around the world are looking at? I think it could be. Now, how would it function as a hedge is an interesting question. Russia and China have been accumulating gold on a net basis for the past 10 to 20 years as they diversify away from U.S. Treasuries. And that's been sort of a slow but substantial trend. And in their view, gold is, kind of the old standby. And so they've been accumulating it. And in their minds, gold is safe. And when the global system starts to unravel, ultimately people look for kind of hard commodities. And when your commodities based off energy trade, in World War II and in the kind of post-war era, that was ripe with inflation and lots of monetary instability, a lot of the commodity producers only took gold as a settlement currency. And so maybe they're posturing for a world where there's a fraying of globalization, where the traditional kind of cross-border settlement systems like SWIFT are inaccessible to them. And so Russia and China have been setting up their own versions of SWIFT. In China, it's called CIPS, CIPS, and in Russia, it's called SPFS. And they've done a lot of work they're still tiny. They're not nearly as interoperable as SWIFT is, but they're sort of trying to construct backup plans, backup systems to be able to trade and settle. And Russia, they're an energy superpower. That's what they do. And China is a production superpower. That's what they do. And so when you have energy and production in a strategic alignment with their own mutual settlement rails, what the West has is network effect of the dollar, US Treasury securities at the base of the global financial system pyramid. And so there's a big competition between what happens when those three sort of legs of the stool, sort of the money, labor, productivity, China, and energy in Russia, come into conflict. And how do those different systems, which were kind of in alignment in kind of a frenemy mode, what happens when they try to disentangle from each other? And Bitcoin is an interesting new wrinkle into that competition. And I don't think I have a clear map for exactly how that's going to play out. But I think it's going to be a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and I think China's take on all of this is interesting because you mentioned Putin is, let's just call him lukewarm on it. And let's call the United States maybe lukewarm. And then we've got China, which is clearly anti-Bitcoin. And so let's get into President Xi's head for a minute here. And how do you think he's thinking about it? Because I know China's aggressively pursuing their digital currency and trying to develop their own thing. And I think that's probably why they're trying to get rid of Bitcoin. But what do you think Xi is thinking in terms of trying to create their own digital currency? And then you've got Russia, who they've got their ruble, and he's somewhat lukewarm on Bitcoin. And then you've got the United States, which has currently the global reserve currency. We've got the SWIFT payment network. So we've got these different systems here. And I know you said, I think we're all just kind of trying to create this map here and connect these different dots because we're not really sure how this is all going to work. And we can only speculate as to what everybody's thinking. But you have some tools that you use, some methodologies that you use to maybe try and game out some of these things. So any insights that you have related to Xi and what he's thinking in terms of Bitcoin and sort of the, and I guess maybe along with that, would you say that we are in a tripolar world at this point with the US, China, and Russia? Or how do you think about the balance of power among the big powers these days?
Yeah, so I'll park that question for a second. Specifically on Xi and the digital yuan, that is clearly a strategic priority of the CCP and the People's Bank of China for the past several years. They've had it in, it's been in development for many years, and now they're ready to launch it. And the principal objectives that they have are both domestic as well as international. So domestically, they want to kind of, secure their rule, and that involves being able to monitor and control their economy and their population. And so the digital yuan is just a piece of the larger technical suite that they're implementing domestically for kind of social credit systems, surveillance, monitoring. And so it gives them a new tool to be able to control behavior and to enforce adherence to the party's instructions. And so that's the domestic objective for the digital yuan. But they also have an international objective for the digital yuan, which is somewhat in alignment with their Belt and Road Initiative, which got launched in 2013, which not coincidentally is the same year that China's holdings of US Treasuries peaked. And so you can see the trend among sort of China and how they think about the West and US in particular, I think hit an inflection point then, and where they had been in accumulation mode of US treasuries because we run a structural trade deficit with them. We send them billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars every year as a result of buying all the goods that they make. And then they get those dollars, what are they gonna do with them? They used to recycle them back into treasuries, which was a great kind of recycling mechanism. It was good for us because we had a buyer of our debt. And we could then fund all of our adventures in the Middle East based off of essentially Chinese financing. And then they decided after 2013, maybe this isn't the best thing for us. And so then they started taking those dollars and instead of recycling them in US treasuries, they embarked on a dramatic and ambitious program of dollar-denominated overseas lending, what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, to make a bunch of investments in Africa, Asia, throughout Central Asia, even in South America, to fund ports, infrastructure, secure kind of hard assets, land, et cetera, to spread their influence, to secure hard assets. Oftentimes they're making loans to governments where if the government can't pay, China has the claim to that hard asset. So they get the port. And so they're sort of win-win for them. And so the digital yuan, but those are still dollar-denominated loans. And so they're structurally supporting the dollar-based system. But in a sense, that's been to our disadvantage. So folks used to think of the dollar as an exorbitant privilege for the US, and it really was for many decades. But really, China in the past 10 years has sort of turned it against us. And instead of taking the dollars and recycling them into financing our debt, they've used it to purchase hard assets and spread their influence around the world. And I think this is increasingly recognized as being now an exorbitant burden on the US, that strategically we're essentially subsidizing China's sort of quasi-imperial objectives with the Belt and Road Initiative. So the digital yuan is essentially the digital sort of follow-on to that, where once they secure these relationships overseas, start to build, kind of, some folks might call it neo-colonial, maybe that's a too freighted of a term, with these countries, and then basically try to bring them into China's trade orbit, right? And ultimately China wouldn't want to have to be reliant on US dollar rails to conduct that type of bilateral trade, and so they want to set up their own mechanisms, their own bilateral trade mechanisms, and then ideally be able to just buy those commodities with yuan. They can print yuan, so if they can print yuan and buy hard commodities, then they're getting to where we've been the past several decades, where we can print dollars and go buy hard assets. And that's a great system as long as it doesn't erode your domestic manufacturing base like it did for us over the past 40 years. And so that's their game plan. But because they can't get physical yuan out to those domestic banks, the easiest thing to do is just use digital currency. And so the digital yuan is a key element of President Xi's initiative to solidify China's status as a peer competitor to the US and carve out a sphere of influence that's equal to ours in Asia and across the world. So it's one element of his strategic ambitions, but it's a key thing that we're going to see over the next few years. And then I guess to your other question about where does that fit in now with China emerging, Russia, Europe, and then the US? Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's hard to simplify the world system into just sort of a simple scheme like there's three powers and they're competing for it, because there's a lot of other players, a lot of other actors that have roles. And in a system where one country controls a key asset, then there's a lot of geopolitical importance to that one country, like take Taiwan, right? So the chips in Taiwan's not a very big country, but it is of geostrategic importance. And so that's like essentially a subplot in the sort of the growing competition between China and Russia. But that's, I think, where you're going to see a lot of the action is on as we sort of deglobalize a bit, and COVID has accelerated the recognition of how vulnerable our supply chains are and how a lot of what we rely on, it comes from distant factories. And if those factories, if any little thing happens along that production chain or that supply chain, we get big problems. And when it's like strategic things like medicines or personal protective equipment, it becomes a national security problem. And so there's recognition that we need to bring some of that production capacity onshore, but that takes time and it raises costs. So you're going to see this sort of decoupling, I think, but it's going to be, I think, a little bit messy, unless it's precipitated by some crisis, and then it's going to be more disruptive.
So let's go back to the China situation here for a minute, and I'm going to read a quote here from your article in, I think it was Real Clear Policy. And you said, quote, "The existence of Bitcoin is a severe complication for China's central bank digital currency ambitions, presenting an attractive store of wealth and effective cross-border payment system to those Belt and Road Initiative nations that China seeks to entangle with their e-currency. Meanwhile, global demand for dollar-pegged stablecoins has exploded, especially by citizens of emerging markets facing currency distress." So my question is, so China clearly is like anti-Bitcoin, and they want their own digital currency. But then they've got all these other nations where they've got their Belt and Road Initiative stuff going on that maybe find Bitcoin to be attractive. So that's a conflict. So how can China resolve that conflict? Could it actually get to the point where China would say, look, forget this Bitcoin thing. If you want to do business with us, you need to use our currency. And then they're forced to, because they're sort of at the mercy of China because of all of the loans that China has given them. Is that a possibility?
Possible. I mean, that's a few steps ahead, I think, of where they are in the near future. I mean, so if you take countries like Nigeria, where there's massive amounts of Bitcoin adoption, and they're also, have strong relations with China, that I think will be a bellwether test of how these things are going to start to interact. And I'm no expert on the Nigerian sort of political system or their financial system, or to what extent the sort of bottom-up adoption of Bitcoin would, countervail some maybe elite interest in alignment with China, and how that's going to play out. But I think that dynamic is going to be there in a lot of these countries, where you see this sort of domestic organic adoption of Bitcoin and stablecoins. I think that's actually going to be a key enabler of this, actually, maybe even more so than Bitcoin in the near term, because a lot of these countries, the populations, what they really lack is like a stable currency unit that they can transact with. And so Bitcoin is useful right now as a savings vehicle long term, but has exceptionally high volatility. And if you make $10 a day, right, you're not going to park all of that into Bitcoin if you need to pay for lunch the next day. So dollar-based stablecoins. And I think Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation has really done some interesting reporting on this, where, like Tether, as much as it's maligned by sort of Western financial commentators as sort of this scammy, somewhat shady, offshore sort of quasi kind of piggy bank, it's actually having a real tangible impact for here, sort of, these developing country populations. And so I think you're seeing this emerging interplay between dollar-based stablecoins that are kind of proliferating now globally, especially in these countries where they may be nominally banned, but all it takes is a smartphone and maybe even a VPN, or maybe even not, depending on the nature of the country, to adopt it. And the market finds a way. And if there's a market demand for these things, it's going to happen. I think that's where the U.S. has an inherent advantage, is that the market's telling China they don't want the digital RMB, right? China has to compel, to a certain extent, at the national level, the adoption of digital RMB, whereas the market's telling you right now, dollar-based stablecoins are in exceptional demand, and the U.S. government is not pushing that. In fact, they're making it hard, right? So the fact that you see the U.S. dollar in sort of this crypto form succeeding in the wild, is really encouraging. I think the U.S. should sort of take a lesson from that and think about, oh, okay, there's something interesting happening here. There's a sort of organic phenomenon that's connected to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency that could actually be in our strategic interest and could actually help provide a bulwark against these Chinese ambitions. But also, I think for these other nations, and not necessarily it's a pure East versus West thing, it also allows them to essentially sort of step out of the game, right? Where they don't want to get involved in necessarily picking SWIFT versus picking the Chinese system. Here's a third option that's geopolitically neutral, that allows them to kind of stay out of the fray. And I think that's another interesting development that you could see countries like El Salvador, where they're adopting Bitcoin as a legal tender. They still have dollars as a legal tender, and I think it's trying to find a new version, maybe a non-aligned movement you could see emerge around this new sort of digital financial infrastructure. Again, that's more speculative, because I think we're only seeing kind of the barest hints of it now. But I think it's behooves sort of national policymakers to sort of think about this and study it and get ahead of it and think about ways that we can leverage this organic bottom-up phenomenon to secure the national interest, right? And I think the U.S. has a really strong national interest in seeing Bitcoin succeed globally, and we stand to benefit more than most nations to see Bitcoin succeed.
So let's say I'm the president. Let's say I'm a member of Congress. And why would I be anti-Bitcoin? Why would I be anti-stablecoins? What are the things about those things that would make a politician in the United States say that I don't think this is in the best interests of the United States? What are they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to red team this, right, from the kind of institutional legacy perspective. And honestly, like the biggest thing that I think the national security perspective is worried about when it comes to cryptocurrency more generally. I don't think Bitcoin is necessarily at the center of those concerns, but sort of the broader evolution of offshore crypto dollars is really sanctions. We've become exceptionally reliant on sanctions as a tool of national power. And it's been a sort of an equal substitute for military power in many ways for the past several decades, and we've wielded it very often. And there's been a lot of professional conversation around, have we overused sanctions? Have they become essentially counterproductive in many ways? Have many of our allies really reacted negatively to the overuse of those sanctions, including secondary sanctions, to the point where they kind of backfire? And but that is, I think, still that's so ingrained in sort of when you have these conversations at the Deputies Committee of the National Security Council, and you think about courses of action to respond to some adversary, sanctions is like the top of the list. It's like, we need to just penalize them. Who can we sanction to try to compel them to change their behavior? And because it's just been so much as part of the go-to in the toolkit, no one wants to see like a key tool go away. And I think it's going to take some adaptation, right? But I think it's inevitable, right? And I think without Bitcoin, it was going away. And it's a matter of, okay, well, how do you then accommodate yourself to this new reality? Don't just sort of look back to a past that it gave you certain advantages and think that those are going to just endure inevitably. The world changes around you, and if you don't adapt to it, then you're going to be behind the curve. So I think leaders see that as a big thing. They're still right now in the process of reconciling it, and there's different camps. There's the camp that just says, no, like, we need to keep that control. What can we do to keep that control? And they're going to try different things, right, through FATF and other sorts of making it difficult, or try to do certain policies to keep their umbrella coverage of those types of mechanisms as strong as possible. But I think there's other folks that are recognizing this is a new reality, and how do they adapt to it? And so, yeah, there's different camps, and like any new innovation, technology innovation that also starts to affect economic interest, there's going to be winners and losers, right? And that tends to play out. Who kind of sees this coming early and gets on the right side of it, and who then kind of feels that they're now maybe kind of on the losing end. And there are going to be folks that have really anchored their fortunes to like the leverage game of U.S. Treasury securities are going to be in for it. I think that's really my biggest sort of macroeconomic, I wouldn't say thesis, but sort of interest area, is how the Treasury-based monetary system, which was really what undergirds the global dollar-based system, is Treasury securities, and how that's going to evolve, and how Bitcoin's going to interface with that. Like, that's the key question. Like, Treasuries, securities over everything has been the rule of national security policymakers for the past several decades. Like, save the bond market, right? That's been the key, because the bond market is upon which everything is built. The problem is what we're going into is a period where we have so much debt that we have to clear that debt by running higher inflation. But higher inflation creates political problems. And so you get this pendulum back and forth between, we need to have the higher inflation to clear this debt. We have higher debt to GDP than after World War II. And we have, twin deficits. And we have a really, somewhat fraying social fabric. And, we can't do what we did between 1945 and the early 50s, where we did this, beautiful deleveraging, where we had yield curve control and we ran inflation hot, and we essentially devalued our debt, and we reset, and we were able to kind of launch ourselves into a kind of global power. And so the problem is we don't have all those structural advantages that we did back then, but we need to basically impose losses on bondholders somehow. And those bondholders are going to see that coming shortly, and they're not going to want to take it. And so what you see is the Fed and the Treasury putting in place mechanisms to essentially force losses on bondholders, but doing it in kind of a nice technocratic way. And there's lots of mechanisms by which they're going to do this. They've already set up, like Basel III regulations. You have to hold these bonds if you want to, be a bank of certain status. If you want to be a pension fund or insurance company, you have to hold these bonds. These capital ratios, you just have to hold these things, even if they're losing value. There's going to be more of that. And I think the next move is going to be central clearing in U.S. Treasuries, where the Fed essentially imposes a transaction tax for any funding activity involving Treasuries, which is what funds most global dollar-based derivatives and trading. And so they're going to try to shave points off of Treasuries and do that over a long enough period of time. The problem is, when do those folks recognize that that's going to happen and that's inevitable, and then try to get out of that game? And then what will fill that role as a neutral reserve asset that is less vulnerable to that type of financial repression? And I think Bitcoin is there as like an emerging alternative to that. Now, how does that play out over time, where Bitcoin grows over time to supplant the role of Treasuries? That's going to be that's the big question, right? Can the United States transition the global financial system in a way that doesn't result in the collapse of the Treasury market, and then all bets are off for U.S. power, but have a sort of a stable transition to something different that resets it with an asset in a system that's neutral, but also that we have kind of inherent advantages with. I mean, the alternatives are gold, which Russia and China have massive holdings of, or like an electronic SDR, which has been in the works at the IMF and some conversations that they're working on. Again, very early days, where kind of a neutral asset currency that can be traded, across countries that have moved to this sort of CBDC model. So that's, I think, where the big action is going to be on the sort of geoeconomic front, is as Bitcoin starts to be increasingly adopted and starts to play this role as a neutral reserve asset, sort of a quasi gold. Now, under the hood, there's going to be a lot of other things going on, right? As a peer-to-peer payment system with Lightning Network, at other countries that are adopting it essentially as legal tender. So there's going to be kind of different narratives for different entities, but that's going to be kind of the geopolitically relevant narrative, is as a neutral reserve asset. And then how do we navigate a period where we need to enter into financial repression in order to clear our debts and not destabilize the Treasury market? And so I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but I think that's where Bitcoin's going to play kind of more of a macroeconomically relevant role in the next 10 years.
But Matt, we have MMT.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've tried that, and we got 7.5% inflation. I mean, the MMT is I don't know, it's been in the news, right? But I don't want to litigate all of that. It's kind of a trigger word for people. But the premise of it is, it's actually quite straightforward in its premise. The problem is it's impossible politically to implement, because you need to commit to taxing the inflation out. So run the economy hot, and then have a political system that's prepared to, drain liquidity through political mandate. And I just don't know any society that's going to vote for higher taxes just because inflation's hot. I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, well, this whole idea about the Treasury market getting disrupted is, I mean, let's think about how that would happen. So what would that mean? Would that mean that interest rates would just go through the roof? So I'll just ask you that. So when we say disrupt the Treasury market, does that mean no one wants to buy our Treasuries, so interest rates have to go up to encourage people to buy our Treasuries? So would that be one example?
Well, we got a taste of this in March of 2020, where there was a disorder. There was a breakdown in the Treasury market, and the Fed has come out, and I think there was a Treasury report on this. Now, where that came from was in off the runs. So in the Treasury market, there's like on the runs and off the runs, and off the runs are those Treasury securities are essentially like not fresh. They're like the older ones. And so they're traded in the secondary market and held by a lot of people who hold Treasuries. The majority of them are either like big institutions or governments. And there was just a lot of selling by governments to their primary dealers and their market makers. And market makers basically said, we don't want any, we can't take any more. And it sort of went bidless. It was sort of a market that sort of lost its clearing ability. and the Fed had to step in and say, we'll take it all. Whatever you got, essentially, if you need to sell treasuries, come to us, and we'll give you, basically reserves. We'll give you cash in exchange. And so that was a an indicator, right? It wasn't the full-fledged crisis, but it was a hint that there's some latent instability in the Treasury market that the Fed is now posturing for. And so what they're preparing for in the Treasury market is trying to prevent anything like that from happening through facilities like the standing repo facility, which essentially sets like a ceiling for rates in this new corridor system where they have RRP at the bottom and SRF at the ceiling, and they're trying to sort of move rates through that mechanism, which is different than the sort of previous mechanism where they had kind of a scarce reserve system pre-2008, and they could adjust the level of reserves to target the Fed funds rate. Now they have this sort of quasi-corridor system. So they have that as a way to try to control rates, because if anyone wants to sell treasuries, there's a buyer, and it's the Fed, and you can get cash. And then they have across, but not everyone can get access to the standing repo facility. It's only like a handful of banks. So for like governments, they have FX swap lines, and they have something called FIMA, the Federal Investment Management Authority, and that's for really China. I mean, they don't say that, but FIMA is for China's treasury holdings, so that if China ever wanted to sell treasuries, they could sell it to the Fed and get cash, essentially. Now they try not to publicize that, but that's apparently what it's for. So their job is to prevent anyone from selling treasuries and not finding a buyer. And so that's the game they're playing. But when you play that out, what that means is that the treasury market is effectively backstopped by the Fed's balance sheet. At any point in time, it's sort of QE on demand. Anytime someone wants to trade treasuries for cash, they can just come to the Fed. And they're trying to set up mechanisms whereby anyone in the world could do that. Now, it's somewhat limited now, but as we've seen in a crisis, they just flip the switch, and now anyone can essentially get access to that. So I think what you're seeing is essentially a move to make treasuries more fungible with cash. But that works in a crisis up to a point. The problem is, what happens if people don't even trust like the treasury market itself, right? Whether they think that the balance of payments issues become so catastrophic that we can't make good on those payments, and that's where you get to kind of this disorderly unwind. And yeah, I don't know exactly how that would all play out, but the scenario of someone trying to sell treasuries and not finding a buyer, they've quote unquote fixed that. But the problem is the way they fixed it is by effectively making all treasuries somewhat cash equivalent. And if you think about it, that's like inherently inflationary, because now those treasuries, which there's 30 trillion of US debt outstanding, and they're they're hypothecated I don't know how many times in offshore derivatives markets. All of that is essentially cash, is essentially now made equivalent to cash, and which is not what they were treated before, right? It's not like as universal as that, because they have different maturities. But that's the fundamental move that the Fed has been forced into, is essentially move. And the one step you play this out is because those treasuries are now the foundation for this global Eurodollar system, which I don't know how many tens of trillions of dollars that is. It underpins all of that, right? So anytime someone wants to make a dollar-based loan, they have treasury as collateral. What backs that dollar-based loan that some offshore bank just made is backed by the treasury, which is now backed by the Fed's balance sheet. And so the Fed is effectively putting the Eurodollar system on its balance sheet. It just isn't counted yet. And so people haven't counted that in, right? If you counted that in, if you said those are all dollars, then that's like an exceptionally inflationary impulse. So I don't know how that's going to play out. I mean, their game is to sort of extend and pretend, to try to, euthanize the treasury market, essentially, impose losses through financial repression for the next 10 years. And then once they've, exsanguinated the treasury market for 30, 40, 50% over 10 years, reset US debt to GDP, then they can, unwind those controls, go back to quote unquote a normal market. That's their ideal game plan. If they could snap their fingers and play something out like the 40s into the 50s, that's what they're trying to do. I don't know if it's going to work, but that's what they're trying.
Well, but let's say that something very disruptive happened in the treasury market and everybody wanted to sell their treasuries. The Fed backstops it. People get US dollars cash for their treasuries that they're selling. Well, then where do they put those dollars? I mean, where does that money go?
Well, this is where if you're an institution, you've got treasuries, you're selling it, you're just trading it for a different account at the Fed. You're essentially, I'm giving you treasuries and I get like a reserve account that has dollars in it, right? But they're just reserves. They're just, they're deposits at the Fed. And the question is though, are those spendable, right? And so this is like essentially QE on a macro scale, right? Where QE is giving banks reserves, but reserves can't be used to buy coffee. So they're not like immediately inflationary unless they get converted into, you call it like second layer money, right? Money that people actually use in the economy. And so the question with this would be, do those cash reserves become spendable in other ways? And it depends on who those counterparties are. And this gets really into the technical plumbing. And I've tried to dig into this, but I'm not an expert of exactly how like money market funds in this world play that out. Because on the other side of money market funds are those retailers, consumers who would essentially get indirect access to the Fed's balance sheet. And this is where you see essentially this evolution to, I don't think it'll be a Fed coin CBDC per se, but as I think you see the trends going with dollar-based stablecoins becoming increasingly regularized in essentially forced to hold treasuries as their reserve asset. And so then now they're becoming de facto money market funds. But the interesting wrinkle is what they issue are crypto dollars instead of money market shares. And if they get really big, the same problems that the money market fund ran into that forced the Fed to essentially give the money market funds access direct to their balance sheet could happen with the stablecoin issuers, where essentially they get access to the Fed. And now stablecoins are effectively second layer money, just like money market shares or bank deposits are. And so, the Fed is trying to keep a lid on all these little emerging, pieces of the dollar system that they can't control. That if there's any breakage, there's defaults that can quickly cascade and create, a global, deflationary collapse if there's no one backing up those dollar claims. And that's what they're worried about, is they don't have the system built yet. They don't have central clearing. They don't have counterparties all have access to these facilities. Whether in a crisis they could open them up, how quickly could they be able to staunch the bleeding if there was, that flip switch and everyone now doesn't trust their counterparty, calls in their claim, and then that causes a hypothecation, collapse. And then that's where you get to the deflationary depression, is when all those credit claims, domino into the floor. And so that's what they're trying to prevent, is the world has so much debt that it's very fragile. Debt makes things fragile. And there's lots of these chains of collateral obligation that if only one little piece of it fails, then the rest of it can come down. The problem is we have to maintain so much growth. Like, when you have that much debt, it's just harder to even generate more debt, because the debt that you have drags you down. You have to keep servicing that debt. And so this is where interest rates, this is where, it's like, will Powell blink, right? It's like, well, structurally he has to blink at some point. Like, it's just math. Like, if it costs too much to service the debt we have, things just break. We just collapse. And then they have to flip it around and then, restart the credit games. And that's, but it's a delicate issue, right? It's not like a finely tuned dial where they can sort of turn it up or down. It's a switch. And they tried to flip the switch in COVID, helicopter money, stimulus payments, and it was too much. And now they're like, oh, okay, we're trying to turn it off, but you can't just turn it off. So yeah, I don't know in the Treasury, I think they've got the Treasury market under control. They don't have the rest of the credit market under control by any means, right? So high yield credit and all those other kind of instruments, they're not going to bail those out, they say. And then, but that's the game, is how much moral hazard are they implicitly or explicitly committed to? And what's the end game from that moral hazard? Is you're going to pay for it one way or the other.
But then you've got China. Now, you mentioned earlier that China's treasury holding peaked in 2013, but I think they still hold hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. treasuries. So
Yep.
they're not gonna see that money go away either. So what's the strategic game playing there between the U.S. Treasury market and China, which owns hundreds of trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions? They're not going to want to see it explode. So, any thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
No one has an interest. I don't think China or Russia have an interest in seeing the global system collapse. I mean, no one does, right? That would be a lose-lose for everyone. What I think they have an interest is seeing a slow shift away on the margin to allow them to restructure their economy from like a export driven production based economy to more of a service consumption based model, try to escape the middle income trap. But they're not there yet. And so they're in this sort of middle period where they can't just drop the dollar system right now. If they did, they would lose just as much as us. But they're going in a certain direction, and it's away from. They need to hold treasuries because they still have massive amounts of dollar-based trade. They haven't shifted all of their trading partners to yuan yet. I mean, it's on the margin and it's increasing on a sort of a relative basis. It's shifting away from dollars to yuan-denominated commodities, and they're doing a lot of these arrangements with countries to essentially do yuan-based commodity trade. But it's not ready to do everything yet, and there's dollars are still the coin of the still the coin of the realm, and I think they're just positioning for a transition away from. And I think people tend to think it's like a collapse of the dollar and the rise of the yuan, or it's like an either or. I mean, you can easily imagine a scenario where it's just there's multiple reserve currencies in different trading blocks, where it's just a relative repositioning of currency regimes. And instead of having a single dominant reserve issuer, you move to more of a relative market share, essentially, of different currency blocks. And that's going to be disruptive in its own way, but it doesn't necessarily require a collapse of the dollar for that to happen. It just requires a shift away from the dollar. And I think that's almost inevitable, just because the U.S. as a share of global GDP just isn't large enough to keep enough dollars in the world system. In fact, that's folks like Jeff Snyder have remarked upon this, is like there's just a shortage of dollars, and because we can't generate enough of them, because our economy isn't as big as a relative share of the global economy to provide them enough dollars. And we've been doing our best by running these massive trade deficits and just trying to spray the world with these dollars, and doing other things like these Fed facilities, just FedEx, FX swaps. Hey, here's dollars. Everyone gets dollars. It's just not enough. And I think that just shows you that there isn't enough productive capacity in the country to consumption capacity, essentially just like basic economic energy, to keep the global reserve status of the dollar intact indefinitely. And then it's a question of, okay, does it shift to a relative regime where there's euros and yuan, ESDRs? It could be go a number of different ways, and it depends on politics, depends on wars, it depends on lots of things. Bitcoin adoption in many of these ways is going to be a dynamic that's a part of that. So yeah, I think people tend to catastrophize and think that there's like some crisis that's going to trigger the final denouement, and then it's going to be a new dawn. And I think the world doesn't really work that way. I mean, even in the big crisis moments of history we've seen, when you actually study them, they're not as I'd say like disjunctive. There's always some continuity, but there's a regime shift, and there's certain things from the previous regime that sort of get modified. There's some new things that get added in, but it's not like this sort of blank slate. And I think that's where, I mean, it's very difficult because you have to sort of reason through that sort of opaque future about, well, what's going to get carried through, what's going to change, what's going to be added in. And it's a complex adaptive system. No one knows exactly how it's going to play out, but that's how I would think about it. And especially then in the next 10 years, I think where it's going to be a lot of these things are going to happen just because of the dynamics that are now coming to a head.
Yeah, I think the key point there, among many that you've made, is you talked about the system being a complex adaptive system, and I think that's so true. I recently went back and read President Reagan's inaugural speech from 1981, and one of the things that he railed about back in 1981 was the federal deficit. And back then it was 900 and some billion dollars. It wasn't even a trillion. And here we are now, I think, what is it, like 30 trillion? So we've been railing about deficits for decades and decades, and yet the country hasn't imploded, the world hasn't imploded. And so, as you say, it's a complex adaptive system. And there's a lot of things that interact, and you and I can sit here and we can talk and we can speculate, but ultimately it's all these variables interacting with each other that somehow on the other end, it seems to work. And yes, there's a lot of pain that can happen between now and then. And I think, and I've said this on a previous podcast about with Bitcoin, it seems like maybe it's the right thing at the right time. And it started long enough ago, 2009, and it's got
Mhm.
enough traction at this point that maybe it's that thing that sort of greases the skids here that enables the system to not implode. And as you're describing here,
Mhm.
gives the world the opportunity to reset with all this debt that we've
Mhm.
got. And then we've got a hard form of money with Bitcoin, and we've got all this geopolitical stuff going on that maybe somehow it all
Mhm.
works out. Again, a lot of pain between now and then. I don't want to minimize that because a lot of people could get hurt, but I think that's perhaps the glimmer of hope in here.
Yeah, and I would say, the U.S., right? I'm an American, right? I'm not a like a I can say like, oh, Ray Ra, America is the best. All these other countries are terrible. But I want to see the U.S. succeed. I want to see where I live be strong and safe and economically vibrant. Like that's sort of my personal interest, right? So I haven't, I think there's an opportunity here for the U.S. to leverage this organic peer-to-peer, open, neutral monetary asset and network to its advantage. And it's both from like hard-nosed economic realities, right? Like the fact that we have probably a plurality of mining hash share. We have a plurality, probably, if not a majority of Bitcoin itself held by US citizens and companies. Most of those Bitcoin miners and Bitcoin companies are listed in the US stock market. A lot of the people that want to work for those companies are going to come to the US to work for those companies. They're growing rapidly. So just as an economic, piece of our strategic interest, like this is a net positive, right? The more Bitcoin succeeds, the more our economic situation improves. We stand to gain disproportionately from the monetization of Bitcoin than almost any other country in the world. And we're developing that, exponentially. I mean, that story a year ago would have been more uncertain, right? Before China banned Bitcoin mining, and I think that was a real shift. And now you're seeing, in West Texas and other parts of the country, a really dramatic evolution of a new industry kind of emerging. And Bitcoin mining, I think, is going to have a really powerful impact on our energy system. Both to incentivize renewables because they're essentially a buyer of a sort of first and last resort. They're essentially flexible loads. They can help you maintain stability of the grid. There's other folks colleagues of mine at the Bitcoin Policy Institute are write a lot about this. But it really is a kind of a counterintuitive idea. It's like Bitcoin is actually good for our energy system. It actually helps us incentivize renewables. So to the extent that we have these national goals about decarbonization, and we haven't talked about climate change, but that's a true strategic challenge over the next several decades, and it's going to interact with these existing monetary challenges that we have. And so people think Bitcoin bad for climate, but actually Bitcoin good for climate. Bitcoin as a way to help achieve these objectives for flexible load as a percentage of our electric grid, and help incentivize renewable build out and things like nuclear that need sort of a large upfront sort of buyer to help kind of recoup their capital investment. So there's that aspect of it, but then there's just the I think the softer kind of values aspect of it, right? Like if you had to compare digital Yuan versus Bitcoin, right? Like which one's better in alignment with US values, right? I think it's a pretty obvious story, right? Like one's an open protocol, opt-in, peer-to-peer. It's all about basically individual liberty, free speech, privacy, right? These things are sort of part of the sort of the ethos of the sort of national sort of political identity that America holds for itself, and that's certainly stands in stark contrast to these states that we've talked about, Russia and China, who are decidedly not liberal, and their view of those values is antithetical to ours. And to the extent Bitcoin helps instantiate those value systems, it's not just like a human rights campaign, it's an actual human rights tool, right? And that's not just helping kind of the marginal in our own society kind of get access to a financial asset that's not kind of redlined away from them or has certain accredited investor hurdles. It's anyone can buy 50 cents of Bitcoin, and that applies across the world. I think that's a underappreciated aspect of it. So yeah, I think there's lots of layers to it, right? Both kind of what we've talked about mostly, just the great game, the geopolitics, the macroeconomics, which is abstract and kind of there's a lot of dynamics there. But I think practically speaking, there's tangible things that Bitcoin is doing right now. But I think there's still my like final critique is that the U.S. is not really, I mean, at least at a national policy level, is sort of not really woken up to this yet. And I think there's an executive order coming out in a few weeks that I think is going to be mostly about telling the sort of different arms and legs of the government, wake up, right? Figure this out, right? And give instructions for lots of people to write lots of reports and, try to understand it in various ways, which is a positive sign. The question is, okay, are they going to understand it actually, or is it going to be somewhat blinded by sort of preconceptions of what this is? So that's where my whole reason for getting involved in this is really to try to help make that argument and to help like raise that conversation in kind of the more traditional sort of national security policymaking conversation about Bitcoin is not just sort of this niche fringe phenomenon. It's now going to be a serious economic thing you're gonna have to recognize and adapt to, but also as an opportunity to understand and how to leverage. I mean, technology change has usually been a driver of American national power. A lot of the underlying technologies of Bitcoin are, come out of U.S. investments. The internet, cryptography, distributed systems. These are the things that Bitcoin is made of, and so it's essentially inherently American to that extent. And I think we are going to recognize that. It's just a question of when, and do we make mistakes? Do we stumble along the way? And do we let others kind of catch up to us, which, isn't ideal.
Well, Matt, I think you've stated a very eloquent case for the United States viewing Bitcoin as a strategic asset. We didn't even talk about the mining piece and how that could be viewed as a strategic asset as well, but this has been fantastic. So appreciate you being on the show. What's the best way for folks to stay in touch with you and connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just on Twitter at Matthew_Pines, and I'm also a contributor to the Bitcoin Policy Institute, so btcpolicy.org, and I work with a great number of other fellows there, some of which have been on your show. We're really interested in kind of getting some of this type of content, white papers, op-eds, into the public conversation and really inject facts and accuracy and, informed analysis, to help, drive this conversation in a positive direction. So, reach out, DM, hit me up on Twitter. Always good to engage in a nice repartee. It's fun. So, thanks for having me.
Sounds great. All right. We appreciate it, Matt. Thanks for being on the show.
Yes, thank you.